The unseen divide. The atmosphere in the cabin seemed to hum with an unsettling undercurrent. While most passengers had settled into their seats, reading books or scrolling through their phones, Marcus couldn't shake the sense that something was off. Maybe it was the odd feeling of being alone, with his father's absence weighing on him more than he expected. Or perhaps it was the way the flight attendants moved through the aisles, each step sharp and deliberate, as if they were part of a well-rehearsed performance. Marcus's heart fluttered in his chest as he clutched his sketchbook, his escape from the sterile world of airports and airplanes. The moment the engines roared to life and the plane began its ascent, he was caught in a sense of awe. His wide eyes watched as the ground fell away beneath them, and the world stretched out beneath a blanket of clouds. There was a surreal beauty to it, the way the horizon curved into infinity. He loved to draw, he always had. It was the way he understood the world, how he made sense of the places and faces he encountered. His pencil moved quickly across the page, capturing fleeting expressions of his fellow passengers. The businessman who sat next to him was focused intently on his phone, his brow furrowed in concentration. The elderly woman across the aisle smiled as she spoke softly to the flight attendant. Marcus couldn't help but notice how each person, though separated by 1,000 miles of air, still held their own tiny world inside the confines of their seats. It was at that moment that Marcus saw her, the stewardess. Helen. She glided down the aisle with a practiced grace, her gaze piercing the crowd with a detached coldness. Her uniform was immaculate, and she moved like someone accustomed to authority, her every step deliberate and purposeful. As she passed by Marcus's row, her eyes flicked toward him, momentarily lingering. It was a fleeting glance, but it was enough to make him pause. He wasn't sure why, but something about the way she looked at him made him uneasy. Maybe it was the sharpness in her eyes or the stiffness in her posture, but it felt like she was silently judging him. Marcus brushed it off. He wasn't one to read too much into things. But then, she stopped and turned back toward him. Her voice, when it came, was loud and clear, breaking the silence of the cabin. "You're alone on this flight?" she asked, her words almost accusatory. Marcus blinked, momentarily stunned. "Yes," he replied, his voice small and unsure. "I'm heading to see my dad. He's already there for a business trip, so he sent me ahead." Helen's eyes narrowed, scanning him with a look that seemed to pierce right through him. Marcus tried to ignore the discomfort creeping up his spine as she studied him, like she was evaluating more than just his words. "Where's your guardian? Don't you think a young boy should be accompanied on a flight?" Helen's voice grew more insistent. It wasn't just a question, it felt like an accusation, as if she were questioning his right to be there. Marcus swallowed, his throat dry. "My father thought it would be good for me to travel on my own," he said, trying to explain. I'm fine." The stewardess tilted her head, almost as if she were examining him like a specimen. She seemed to take pleasure in making him squirm under her scrutiny, and the longer she stood there, the more Marcus felt exposed. She didn't say anything for a moment, her lips pursed tightly. Finally, she spoke again, her words deliberate and slow, like she was trying to make a point. "Well," Helen said, her tone colder than before, "I think you're sitting in the wrong seat. This seat is for paying customers, people who belong here." The words hit Marcus with a jolt. His cheeks flushed hot with embarrassment, and he tried to push back the rising tide of frustration. I paid for this seat. It was assigned to me." Helen ignored him, instead reaching into the overhead compartment and pulling out a stack of seat assignment papers. She glanced at the paperwork and then at Marcus, her gaze sharp and accusing. "I think you need to move to the back of the plane," she said flatly, gesturing toward the rear of the cabin. "This section is for those who know how to behave. You're disturbing the peace here." Marcus's stomach twisted in knots. He could feel his heart racing in his chest, his palms growing sweaty. He had never felt so small in his life. I don't understand," Marcus stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. This is my seat. My father. Helen cut him off with a sharp wave of her hand, her lips curling into a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. Your father won't help you now. Move, or I'll have to call security. Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. He wanted to fight back, to tell her that she had no right to treat him this way, but the words stuck. He glanced around at the other passengers, hoping someone would speak up, but everyone seemed to have their eyes turned away, pretending not to see what was happening. His mind raced. Why was she doing this? What had he done to deserve this treatment? He wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, but he just couldn't find the strength. Something inside him shriveled, as if her words had stripped him of all his confidence and left him exposed. He stood up, his legs feeling unsteady as he made his way to the back of the plane, following her orders like a robot. His heart pounded in his chest as he moved, his face burning with humiliation. As he passed rows of passengers, he saw them looking at him, some with sympathy, others with disdain. No one said anything, but he could feel their eyes on him. He was the object of their curiosity, their judgment. He reached the back of the plane and sat down in a vacant seat, feeling like a stranger in a place that should have felt familiar. The hum of the engines filled his ears, but it did nothing to drown out the turmoil inside him. He wanted to disappear, to shrink into nothingness. But he couldn't. He had to sit there, in silence, with the sting of Helen's words lingering in his ears. The flight continued on its course, but for Marcus, time seemed to stand still. As he stared out the window, watching the clouds roll by, he couldn't help but wonder, why had she done that? What had made her treat him like that, as if he didn't belong? Was it because he was young? Because he was alone? Or was it something deeper? Something about him that she didn't like? The questions swirled in his mind, unanswered and unsettling. And for the first time, Marcus realized that the world was not as kind as he had imagined. He was no longer just a boy on a plane, he was a person, exposed to the cruelties of the world around him. The silent battle. The plane had reached cruising altitude, and Marcus sat in the back, staring out of the tiny window. His seat was near the galley, and he could hear the muffled conversations of the other passengers, but none of them reached him. He felt as though he was isolated in his own little world, the vast expanse of sky outside only adding to his sense of disconnection. The hum of the engines had become a steady backdrop, but it was no longer calming. It felt distant, as though even the plane itself was rejecting him. Marcus tried to focus on his sketchbook again, but his hands were shaky, and the pencil refused to glide smoothly across the page. He could still hear Helen's voice in his head, cutting through the air like a sharp blade. Your kind doesn't belong here. The words echoed, over and over, each time piercing deeper into his mind. Why had she said that? What had made her treat him like that? Marcus had always been taught to rise above any form of prejudice or hatred, but this was something else. It wasn't just a random insult or a passing comment, it felt like a judgment on his very existence, on his right to be in this space, in this seat, at this moment. As he sat there, trying to hold his composure, he felt the weight of those words, growing heavier with each passing minute. His stomach churned with anxiety and confusion, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, not just with Helen's treatment of him, but with the world around him. Was this how it always was? Did people always look at him this way, and he just hadn't noticed? Or was this something new, something that had been brought to light by his own experience? He let out a frustrated sigh and closed his sketchbook, leaning back into the seat. The smooth leather felt cold against his back, and he wrapped his arms around himself as if trying to protect his vulnerable thoughts. Across the aisle, a woman caught his eye. She was older, perhaps in her late 20s or early 30s, with dark hair pulled into a neat bun and glasses perched on her nose. She had been watching him for a while, and when their gazes met, she gave him a gentle smile. It wasn't much, but to Marcus, it felt like a tiny spark of warmth in an otherwise cold and indifferent world. Are you okay? The woman asked softly, her voice kind, her eyes filled with genuine concern. For a moment, Marcus considered saying something, anything to explain what had happened. He wanted to tell her what had occurred, to share the injustice he had just faced, but something held him back. Perhaps it was pride, or perhaps it was the fear of sounding too vulnerable, but he found himself nodding instead. "Yeah," he muttered. "Just tired." The woman seemed to sense the unease beneath his words, but she didn't press further. Instead, she returned her attention to her book, but every now and then, her eyes would flicker over to him, as though checking in, offering him silent support. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to remind Marcus that not everyone in the world was like Helen. There were still kind people out there, people who understood the weight of silent struggles, even if they didn't fully understand the details. Despite this brief moment of connection, Marcus still couldn't shake the deep sense of wrongness that had settled inside him. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. He wasn't just angry at Helen for her cruelty, but at himself, too. Why hadn't he stood up for himself? He knew the answer: fear. He had been so caught up in the shock of the moment, the suddenness of it all, that he hadn't known how to respond. His father had always taught him to stand tall, to face challenges head-on, but how could he do that when the very people who were supposed to offer him protection were the ones causing him harm? As if in response to his thoughts, Marcus heard a voice coming from the front of the cabin. He couldn't see who it was, but the tone was unmistakable. It was Helen. She was speaking to another stewardess, her voice lowered but filled with authority. "Why is he sitting there? That kid doesn't belong up here. He's a disruption." The words burned through the air, and Marcus's blood boiled. A disruption? He wasn't a disruption. He was just a kid, traveling alone. He hadn't done anything wrong. The other stewardess replied, but Marcus couldn't catch the words. All he could hear was the fury building in his chest, the frustration that had been simmering since Helen's first cruel remark. He wanted to stand up and confront her, to demand an apology, to make her understand that what she had done wasn't just rude, it was wrong, fundamentally wrong. But he didn't. He sat there, seething in silence. Because what good would it do? What could a 14-year-old boy say to a grown woman who clearly thought she had the power to decide who belonged and who didn't? His thoughts were interrupted by the sudden click of the intercom. The captain's voice filled the cabin, warm and comforting. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing some light turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. We'll be through this shortly." The calm, professional tone was a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside Marcus. He glanced around at the passengers. Some of them were already buckling their seatbelts, while others simply carried on with their activities, oblivious to the tension that had been building for the past hour. Helen, meanwhile, was making her way down the aisle again, her eyes scanning each row as she passed. When she reached Marcus's seat, she gave him another cold, dismissive glance. He didn't even bother to meet her eyes this time. He knew what she would think. She continued her walk down the cabin, and Marcus was left alone with his thoughts. The silence around him felt suffocating. He wanted to scream, but instead, he took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. It wasn't easy, but he had to keep it together. The rest of the flight felt like a blur. Marcus couldn't focus on anything. He didn't draw, he didn't read, he didn't even pay attention to the movie they played on the screen in front of him. His mind was consumed by the injustice he had faced. He thought about his father, how disappointed he would be if he knew what had happened. And then, as the flight neared its descent, something unexpected happened. The voice of the captain came over the intercom again, but this time, it was followed by another announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final descent. I'd like to take this opportunity to personally thank you for flying with us today. We hope you've had a pleasant journey." The simple words caught Marcus off guard. They were just words, but in that moment, they felt like a lifeline, a small thread of normalcy in an otherwise chaotic and unfair experience. As the plane began its descent, Marcus realized something important. It wasn't just about the seat he was assigned or the stewardess's cruel words. It wasn't even about how the other passengers had ignored him. It was about what he was going to do next. Would he let this moment define him? Or would he find a way to rise above it? Would he let it break him, or would he learn from it and become stronger? The plane touched down smoothly, the wheels skimming over the runway with a reassuring thud. But for Marcus, the real journey was just beginning. The revelation. The plane's tires screeched softly as it made contact with the runway, signaling the end of the flight. However, for Marcus, the journey was far from over. He could feel the gravity of the past few hours pressing down on him. The turbulence, both physical and emotional, had left him exhausted. He had been bracing himself for the moment when he would step off the plane and back into the world, but nothing could have prepared him for what was about to unfold. The seatbelt sign flickered off, and the usual bustle of passengers collecting their things began. Marcus sat there, frozen in place, unwilling to move. He could feel the discomfort of his situation still lingering in the pit of his stomach, gnawing at him. The experience had shaken him deeply, and despite his desire to put it behind him, he couldn't escape the feeling of injustice. He needed to understand what had just happened. Was it just a random act of prejudice, or was there something more at play? As the flight attendants made their rounds, helping passengers prepare to disembark, Marcus was lost in his own thoughts. He barely noticed when Helen, the stewardess who had made him feel so small, passed by once more. She seemed different this time, her shoulders slumped as if weighed down by something. But she didn't meet his eyes. Marcus didn't expect her to. There was no apology in her demeanor, only the same coldness he had seen throughout the flight. But then, as if fate itself had decided to intervene, Marcus heard a voice, one that made him snap out of his daze. It was a deep, familiar voice, commanding and authoritative, yet warm and comforting in a way that was completely at odds with the tension in the cabin. "Marcus," the voice called, and Marcus turned to find a tall man standing just behind him, his eyes scanning the crowd. The man's presence was undeniable, his stature imposing yet somehow gentle. His tailored suit exuded confidence, and his demeanor was one of quiet authority. Marcus's heart skipped a beat as recognition washed over him. The man was his father, John Johnson, the owner of the airline. Marcus had seen him in the news countless times, but to see him standing right there, in the very cabin where he had been humiliated, was surreal. His father's eyes locked onto his with a mixture of concern and something else, something harder, more determined. "Dad?" Marcus whispered, barely able to comprehend what was happening. He had never expected his father to be on this flight, let alone to walk down the aisle of the plane like he owned it, because, in a way, he did. Marcus had always known his father as a successful businessman, but he had never fully grasped the scope of his father's influence. John Johnson's gaze softened as he approached Marcus, his step steady and purposeful. "We need to talk," he said quietly, as he reached down and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. His touch was warm, reassuring, and it instantly put Marcus at ease, even though the flood of emotions he had been carrying made it hard to breathe. Helen, who had been moving toward the galley, froze in place when she saw the man standing there. Her face turned a shade paler, and for the first time, Marcus saw her mask crack, revealing a hint of fear behind her professional exterior. John Johnson's eyes never left Marcus's face, but his voice was loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "Helen, I believe you owe my son an apology," he said calmly, his words cutting through the tense air. Helen blinked, caught off guard by the sudden confrontation. I didn't," she stammered, her voice faltering as she tried to recover from the shock. But Marcus's father didn't let her finish. "You made a mistake," he continued, his voice unwavering. "And I don't take it lightly when people treat my family this way." He turned to face the rest of the cabin, his gaze sweeping over the passengers, many of whom had now become aware of the tension. "It's one thing to serve customers, it's another to degrade them. I suggest you remember who you're serving." Helen stood there, her mouth opening and closing as though she were trying to find the right words, but none came. The silence in the cabin was palpable, and Marcus could feel the weight of his father's words sinking in, not just on Helen, but on the entire flight. For the first time, Marcus felt his pulse steadying. His father's presence was like an anchor in the chaos, and his words, though firm and strong, carried a sense of justice that Marcus had longed for. The entire cabin seemed to shift as the passengers began to stir, some glancing at one another in surprise, others seemingly unsure of how to react. The power dynamics had shifted in that instant. No longer was Marcus the helpless child who had been shoved to the back of the plane. Now, he stood beside his father, a man who commanded respect, and everyone in the cabin could see it. Helen's eyes darted nervously between John and Marcus, and for a brief moment, Marcus saw a flicker of regret in her eyes. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the defensive wall she had built around herself. "I'm sorry," Helen said, her voice small, the apology half-hearted but nonetheless offered. I didn't know who you were." John's eyes never wavered, his expression unchanged. "It doesn't matter who I am," he replied coolly. "It matters how you treat people. Everyone deserves respect, regardless of their background." The tension in the cabin remained thick, but it had shifted from the raw, palpable discomfort Marcus had felt earlier to something else entirely. Something like closure. The words that had been trapped in his throat for the entire flight, those words that had been too difficult to say in the face of such cruelty, finally felt like they were being spoken through his father's voice. Helen muttered a final apology and turned away, but not before casting one last glance at Marcus. There was something in that look, something between regret and shame, that told Marcus this would not be the last time he would encounter people who held prejudices like hers. His father placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, leading him towards the exit. "Let's go," he said softly, his voice now gentle, as if trying to ease the storm within Marcus. As they made their way down the aisle, Marcus glanced back one final time at the scene behind them. The passengers were now talking among themselves, some casting glances his way, others engaged in quiet conversations. But none of that mattered anymore. Marcus had learned something valuable today, something that had eluded him before. It wasn't just about standing up for himself in the moment, it was about knowing when to walk away and when to let someone else's actions speak louder than words. As they exited the plane, Marcus felt a sense of finality. The plane doors had closed behind them, but the weight of the experience lingered, a lesson etched in his mind. The world wasn't perfect, and sometimes it took moments like these, uncomfortable, challenging moments, to force change. His father glanced down at him, his eyes softening as he spoke. "You did well today, Marcus. You showed restraint when you needed to. That's what counts." For the first time in hours, Marcus smiled, his heart swelling with pride. He had stood tall, not because of what had happened, but because of how he chose to handle it. And in that moment, he understood his father's wisdom. The world may not always be fair, but Marcus knew that with his father by his side, and the lessons he had learned, he could face whatever came next. The turning point. The feeling of the cool breeze as Marcus stepped off the plane was oddly grounding. The airport terminal around them was bustling with passengers, some hurrying to make connecting flights, others casually chatting as they made their way toward baggage claim. The usual airport noise, a mix of announcements, rolling suitcases, and the murmur of conversations, felt distant to Marcus, as though he were moving through a different world. He glanced at his father, John Johnson, who walked beside him with a quiet confidence that seemed to calm the chaos around them. Despite everything that had happened on the flight, Marcus couldn't help but admire how his father carried himself, how he always seemed to know exactly what to do, how to handle any situation, no matter how challenging. It was a trait Marcus had long respected, but now, more than ever, he felt the weight of it. His father had stepped in today, not just for him, but for the principle of respect and fairness that was sometimes absent in the world. And now, as they walked through the terminal, Marcus realized that he was no longer the same person he had been when he stepped onto that plane. something inside him had changed. As they reached the exit, Marcus's father stopped for a moment, turning to face him. There was a serious expression on his face, but there was also something softer in his eyes, something Marcus hadn't seen before. His father placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring. "You're upset, I know," John said quietly, his voice laced with understanding. "What happened today wasn't right. But I want you to understand something important." Marcus nodded, his heart heavy with all the emotions he had been carrying since the incident with Helen. He felt a lump form in his throat as he looked up at his father. "Why did she do it? Why did she treat me that way?" His voice trembled slightly, the question that had been haunting him all through the flight finally escaping. John's expression softened, and he took a deep breath. "There are people in this world who judge others based on things that don't matter, like the color of their skin, their background, or their status. It's wrong, and it's something we need to confront, not just with anger, but with strength. And, most importantly, with respect." Marcus didn't respond right away, instead processing his father's words. The frustration he had felt earlier began to shift, transforming into a deeper understanding. His father wasn't just talking about what had happened today, he was talking about life, about the challenges they would face and how they would face them. Marcus realized that his father had been preparing him for moments like these all along, teaching him how to stand tall, how to handle adversity, and how to rise above it with grace. They stepped outside into the warm air, the sun beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky with shades of gold and orange. The day was winding down, but Marcus knew this moment, this lesson, would stay with him long after the sun had set. As they made their way to the car, John turned to Marcus again. "You're going to encounter people who don't understand you, Marcus. People who are quick to judge, to make assumptions about who you are and what you can do. It's not just about what happened on the plane, it's about how you respond when that judgment comes. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. You just need to stay true to who you are." Marcus thought about his father's words as they drove through the city. It felt as though the world had changed in the few hours since they had boarded the plane. He thought back to the moment on the plane, when Helen had humiliated him, and how his father had stepped in to make it right. It wasn't about revenge, it wasn't about teaching someone a lesson. It was about standing up for what was right, and for the first time, Marcus understood that standing up for himself wasn't just about defending his pride, it was about defending his dignity. The drive was quiet, the rhythmic hum of the car tires on the road providing a soothing backdrop to Marcus's thoughts. As they reached their destination, his father spoke again, his voice gentle but firm. "There's one more thing you need to know, Marcus. Sometimes, the hardest thing in the world is to forgive. And the person you might need to forgive the most isn't the one who hurt you, it's yourself." Marcus turned to look at his father, surprised by the depth of his words. He had never heard him speak this way before, with such vulnerability and wisdom. "Forgive myself?" Marcus asked, the question hanging in the air. "Yes," John said, his gaze steady. "You might not have done anything wrong, but sometimes, we carry the burden of those moments longer than we should. We allow them to define us, to limit us. But in the end, it's our ability to forgive ourselves that gives us the strength to move forward." Marcus felt the weight of his father's words sink in, and for the first time that day, he felt the tension in his chest begin to ease. He had been holding on to the hurt and the anger, letting it control him, but now he realized that his father was right. It wasn't just about letting go of the people who had wronged him, it was about letting go of the burden he had been carrying inside. As they arrived at their destination, Marcus felt a sense of peace settle over him. The experience on the plane, as painful as it had been, had given him a clarity he hadn't expected. He now understood that every challenge, every struggle, was an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to become stronger. And most importantly, he understood that no one could take his dignity unless he allowed them to. That night, as Marcus lay in bed, his thoughts drifted back to the moment when his father had stood up for him. He thought about the way Helen had looked when she realized who his father was, the way her smugness had evaporated in an instant. But what stayed with Marcus was not the apology she had given, but the understanding that he had gained through the experience. No one could take away his sense of self-worth. No one could make him feel small unless he allowed them to. And from that moment on, he vowed that he would never allow anyone to strip him of his dignity, no matter the circumstances. As he closed his eyes and drifted into sleep, Marcus knew that the world would continue to present him with challenges, some more difficult than others. But he also knew that with his father's wisdom and his own strength, he would be ready to face whatever came next. The journey wasn't over. It had just begun. The heartwarming resolution. The days that followed the flight felt like a quiet echo of the turbulence Marcus had experienced. His life returned to its normal rhythm: school, time spent with his friends, and quiet evenings with his father. Yet, something had shifted within him. He couldn't ignore the lesson that had been imparted on that plane. It wasn't just the confrontation with Helen or the way his father had stepped in. It was deeper than that. It was about understanding who he was in the face of adversity, and what it truly meant to stand tall, not just for himself, but for others as well. At school, Marcus had become more attuned to the subtleties of the world around him. He saw the small injustices, the moments when people were unfairly judged or treated poorly, and it was impossible for him to look the other way. He had always been a quiet observer, but now, he found himself speaking up when he saw someone being treated unfairly. His father's words echoed in his mind: "You don't have to prove anything to anyone. Just stay true to who you are." Marcus found himself using those words as a shield, a guiding principle that allowed him to navigate the complexities of school life with a newfound sense of confidence. And it wasn't just about standing up for himself, it was about creating a space where kindness, respect, and fairness could thrive. One afternoon, a week after the flight, Marcus was walking through the school hallway when he heard raised voices coming from the student lounge. Curiosity piqued, he stepped closer, only to find two students in the midst of an argument. One of them was a boy he recognized, Jason, a freshman who had always seemed a little out of place. He was skinny, awkward, and often the subject of jokes. The other boy, Kyle, was one of the more popular students, known for his quick wit and sharp tongue. The argument was escalating quickly, and it seemed like it was about to turn into a physical confrontation. Jason's face was flushed with anger, his fists clenched, while Kyle stood with a smug grin on his face. Marcus recognized the look, the same kind of arrogance that Helen had displayed on the plane. He knew what was about to happen, and he couldn't stand by and watch it unfold. Without thinking, Marcus stepped into the space between the two boys. "Hey," he said, his voice steady but firm. "This isn't the way to handle things." Jason looked at him with a mixture of surprise and confusion, while Kyle shot him a look of disdain. "What's it to you, Marcus?" Kyle sneered. "Mind your own business." Marcus didn't back down. "It's everyone's business when someone's getting picked on," he said, his voice unwavering. "You don't have to fight to prove you're better than someone else." For a moment, there was silence, and for the first time, Marcus could see the cracks in Kyle's confident exterior. His smug expression faltered, and the grip on his posture weakened. "You don't know anything about me," Kyle muttered, but Marcus could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "I don't need to," Marcus replied. "I know that you don't need to make someone else feel small to feel good about yourself. It's not worth it." Jason, who had been standing there, seething with anger, looked at Marcus with a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "You really think I can just walk away?" he asked, his voice trembling. Marcus nodded. "Yeah. I do." The tension in the room began to dissipate, like a storm finally passing. Jason lowered his fists, his expression softening, while Kyle, with a reluctant sigh, turned and walked away, the fight drained from him. Jason, still unsure but grateful, turned to Marcus. "Thanks," he muttered. "No problem," Marcus said, offering him a small smile. "Just remember, you don't have to be anyone else. You're good enough as you are." It was a simple moment, a small act of kindness, but it meant the world to Jason. As Marcus walked away, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Not because he had stood up to Kyle, but because he had stood up for what was right. He had become someone who could help others find their way, even when the world seemed to want to tear them down. That evening, after school, Marcus sat down with his father at the kitchen table. They had finished their dinner, and the quiet hum of the dishwasher in the background created a comforting atmosphere. John looked over at his son, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. "I saw what happened today," John said casually, though Marcus could tell there was more to his words than just the surface observation. Marcus met his father's gaze, feeling a sense of warmth spread through him. "I just did what needed to be done." John nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "I'm proud of you, Marcus. Not because you stopped the fight, but because you understood something most people don't: there's always another way. You didn't have to fight back. You didn't have to prove anything. You just showed kindness, and that's more powerful than any fight." Marcus smiled, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. For so long, he had been carrying the weight of his experiences, his doubts, and his fears. But now, he understood. The world wasn't always kind, and there would always be moments when people tried to bring him down. But it wasn't about fighting back with anger. It was about choosing to be better than the people who tried to break him. In the following weeks, Marcus continued to stand by his values. He saw more moments of injustice, more opportunities to make a difference, and he didn't shy away from them. He was becoming the kind of person his father had always hoped he would be, a person who faced adversity with strength, kindness, and integrity. Then, one afternoon, Marcus received a call from the school principal. His heart skipped a beat as he picked up the phone. "Marcus, I wanted to personally thank you for what you did last week," the principal said. "Your actions spoke volumes about your character. You're exactly the kind of student we want to represent our school." Marcus blinked, stunned by the recognition. "I didn't do it for recognition," he said, feeling a bit embarrassed. "I know that," the principal replied, his voice warm. "But sometimes, it's important to recognize when someone is making a positive impact. You stood up for what was right when others were content to look away. That's something rare." As Marcus hung up the phone, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had found his voice, and with it, he had found his purpose. He wasn't just the son of a successful businessman. He was Marcus Johnson, a young man who knew what it meant to rise above prejudice and hatred, to stand up for what was right, and to make the world a better place, one small act of kindness at a time. As he sat with his father that night, he realized that the journey he had started on that flight was far from over. It was just the beginning. And the world ahead, though uncertain and sometimes harsh, was filled with endless possibilities, possibilities that he was ready to face with courage, wisdom, and an unshakable belief in himself. The turning point had come, not through a dramatic confrontation or a moment of glory, but through the quiet moments of understanding, growth, and resilience. And Marcus knew, without a doubt, that he was ready to face whatever came next. The world was waiting for him, and he was ready to make it his own.